Hey, so I was reading the word today and I want to kind of make a video or maybe a rant video a little bit about it. So I was reading the book of Philippians in the first chapter, I think the first, maybe second chapter, I think it's just the first chapter though. And Paul was saying how essentially he's in chains for Christ and how he's in chains for the suffering. He's suffering for Christ, right? And after I read, I was like, okay, so what are some things that I learned, or what are some things that I can, instead of like going off and doing my thing, I think the Lord wanted me to kind of think about what I learned and what are the key points. And one of the key points is, well, there's maybe a few, but I think the number one is suffering for Christ. And Paul's suffering was in chains. He was locked up. Um, and I have a study Bible, and I was reading some of the commentary in it, and it said that, well, Paul didn't speak about, you know, what he was feeling as far as like the intricacies of what he was suffering, like, oh, my arms hurt or my legs hurt or stuff like that, right? But he was plainly just saying, hey, I'm suffering for Christ as a submission to Christ. And I thought about that and how the culture is counterintuitive to that, and how we as a culture where we all complain about things that are going on in our lives. Like, I find myself complaining a lot. I hear different people complaining about, work, complaining about relationships, complaining about finances or whatever the case might be. And also, as a culture, we're not taught to suffer for the good of the other person. We're not necessarily taught to suffer. We're not taught how to suffer. We're not taught how to do a lot of things in this culture, right? And I thought about it. So oftentimes we complain about things, but sometimes maybe it's just we need to suffer for Christ. And it may look differently for all of us. It may be letting go of that sin, letting go of the sin that we have, that's been kind of hindering us from our relationship with the Lord, and then also from the certain blessings the Lord want to bless us with. Maybe it can mean suffering for Christ, like in our job. The Bible talks about how we should submit to authorities, and sometimes we tend to complain about our jobs and the things we have to do, but we ought to do those things in delight. And what I mean by delight is having the right mentality while we're suffering in different ways. It can be in relationships, and a whole bunch of scenarios with that, right? It can be a waiting period that we're in, just in life. And we may be not, we may have prayed about something and we're wanting a breakthrough, or we're wanting an answer, or maybe a yes from the Lord, or whatever the case may be. But sometimes we have to suffer first before we actually, you know, um, because God is teaching us things, right? So, suffering for Christ. Sometimes we want things right now, and it kind of hinders us from, the Lord maturing us to where He wants us to be mature at. Um, so, I thought about that. Paul didn't complain about his sufferings. Paul didn't complain about his sufferings. Paul didn't complain about, oh, my whatever hurts, or they had me doing this, they had me doing that. No, he like delighted in it, because he knew that whatever weaknesses that he was going through, that Christ was going to fill in those gaps and more. We're weak. All of us are weak, so that Christ can show His glory and Christ can show His strength in all of us. So we know everything is from Him. He's the source. Um, so we ought not to complain as much. We ought to try to suffer for Christ in delight, meaning suffering with the right mindset, right? And sometimes we think about things too narrowly. We don't see the big picture that God sees. So we have to trust Him and be able to endure things in life. And in a culture where we're told to do what's best for you, a culture where, like, in relationships, it says, like, oh, if this person's not doing this, then go on to somebody else. Where things are very transactional in our culture and in the way of our thinking. We tend to use people to get what we want, and we don't get it, then we leave on to somebody else. Or maybe we may want to think so much, and then if we're not getting it, then we throw it off to the side and go on to the next thing. But The Lord teaches us patience. The Lord teaches us um, to have faith in Him, to have patience in Him. So if we're going through a waiting season, if we're going through a season of, maybe our jobs aren't doing, certain things that we like for them to do, or if we're in a winning period, or if we're in relationship struggles, just know it's not always we should leave that situation. It's not always we should go on and do what's best for us. What's best for that other person? Because the Bible also says to look at others more significant than ourselves. And sometimes we have to put others above ourselves and our own feelings, while in this culture it tells us to put our feelings first. Put your stuff first. Love yourself first. When in reality, true love is sacrifice, you know? And that's how we actually truly love others, and that's how we actually truly love God. Therefore, already loving ourselves is through sacrifice and through suffering. And sometimes we think of suffering in a bad way. I know what I'm ranting, but sometimes we think of suffering in a bad way, and suffering isn't always bad. Suffering isn't, and excuse my face and everything, my hair, I just woke up and everything. But suffering isn't always bad. Sometimes suffering leads to beauty. Well, actually, a lot of times, because God uses it for His glory. So next time we complain about work, or we're complaining about relationship, or we're complaining about waiting season, keep in mind, it's always for the suffering of the Lord. And we're not wasting our time in honoring the Lord. Because sometimes it feels like we're wasting our time, but in reality, nah. Just wait on God. Just wait on God. Wait on Jesus. And yeah.